Good afternoon. My name is James Major Woodall, and I'm the state president for the Georgia NAACP. We rise today to sound the alarm on the atrocity that is the governor's 2020 and 2021 fiscal year budget. We are concerned that this budget not only represents a commitment to white supremacy, however, it also reflects a commitment to ensuring that we return to the days of Jim Crow. The budget cuts reflect a commitment to taking away every citizen here in the state of Georgia's right to due process. It takes away their opportunity to actually be able to return to society as contributing members of our community. And so we rise today to sound that alarm. Yesterday, there was comments that these budget cuts do not impact everyday citizens, but here as a state president, I tell you that it impacts me. My dad is currently serving 2 life sentences plus 60 years in a Georgia correctional facility, all because, one, he was a person who had committed crimes over and over again. As a result, he was unable to escape that process. So now he is languishing in a prison for the rest of his life. If we have people in these communities that are in these situations, it is our responsibility as community leaders to do everything in our power and in our authority to ensure that they have at least an opportunity to get it right. That is why these budget cuts are atrocious, they're disrespectful, and quite frankly, they're just out of order. And so we have assembled here today other organizations that stand in coalition in support of us, and I'm more than happy to yield the floor to them at this time.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
My name is Kosha Tucker. I'm a staff attorney at the ACLU of Georgia, the American Civil Liberties Union Foundation of Georgia.
Do you mind spelling your first name?
Of course, it's Kosha Tucker. Under Governor Deal, Georgia made a tremendous amount of progress toward a more fair and equitable state and a more fair and equitable criminal legal system. That system worked to restore all Georgians to their communities. But these budget cuts to indigent defense and accountability courts will take Georgia backwards. After very deliberate and bipartisan efforts by Governor Deal and the Georgia Council on Criminal Justice Reform, these cuts would be regressive. As a former public defender myself, I know just how critical it is to fully fund Georgia's public defender system. Public defenders are on the front lines defending the constitutional rights of Georgians every day. The proposed budget cuts to indigent defense directly infringes upon Georgians' constitutional right to counsel and effective legal representation. Furthermore, cuts to accountability courts, which serve as cost-effective alternatives to prison, strips people of their need and reception of necessary treatment, and it prevents them from returning home to their communities. Indigent defense and accountability courts are necessary to sustain the improvements we've seen to our state's criminal legal system. To cut funding to these programs while transferring funds to a potentially unconstitutional so-called game database betrays the promise of America, which is liberty and justice for all. All of these measures will have a disproportionate impact on access to fair and impartial justice for people of color, and that is wrong. We urge legislators to keep the reforms in place that Governor Deal, the state of Georgia, and all citizens of this state work to create. Thank you.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
I am Karen Bennett, the chairwoman of the Georgia Legislative Black Caucus, and I stand here today in solidarity with this coalition to thank President Woodall for bringing us together. We have a common thread among us of equity and justice. And so we stand together declaring that we are demanding equity and justice in this budget. And so without further ado, I'd like to give the podium to my next colleague. Thank you.
I'm Attorney Robert Patel, the Executive Director of the Rainbow Plus Coalition Southeast Region here in Atlanta, Georgia. What we saw last week was that President Trump, during the Super Bowl, spent $10 million talking about criminal justice reform. What we saw was that during the State of the Union address, they talked about the First Step Act. They talked about Second Chance Act. But then directly thereafter, Georgia Republicans introduced legislation and introduced an agenda which will take us back to mass incarceration. Yes. We need to understand where exactly our partners stand on this issue. If they believe that we should continue upon the progress made by former Governor Nathan Deal, if they believe we should continue with programs of accountability, with programs to seek to create a future for people so they are not shackled by their previous criminal in servitude, or do they want to go back to the dark ages when Georgia had one of the largest prison populations in the Western Hemisphere? Let's understand what is at stake. Georgia's future and prosperity rest upon our turning away from the seduction of mass incarceration. We cannot go back. We must take steps forward. We call on the governor to bring in this community on this discussion. Let's find interactive ways to achieve the solutions he is hoping for, to resolve the issues within our community, but also not go backwards on the progress we've made thus far.
Marcus Coleman, founder and president of Save Ourselves, founder and former president of National Action Network, Atlanta Southeastern Regional Headquarters. I just want to go off script just for a quick second and salute to Brother Woodall, the youngest appointed, elected state conference president of the NAACP at 26 years of age. This is all his goal. He wasn't looking for that, he doesn't need that, and that's why I support him and love the young brother for that. I'm here to talk about two issues. Shortly on the budget. I mean, the fix is on. I mean, where do you take up to nearly $3 million of an already depleted program that is supposed to be here to help the least of these? We know with the disparities in the criminal justice system, we know that black, brown, and the hirelings benefit more from this particular program. Not to mention it's our tax dollars. Very familiar to a tactic that street hustlers use called three-card Monte with your tax dollars. More importantly, when I say the fix is on, the governor has already come out in support of proposed legislation that will stiffen the penalties as it relates to gang members. Now follow me when I say this. None of us up here in this coalition, I don't believe any of you in the audience, support crime. No one is pro-crime.
That's right.
But ask yourself, what is a gang? 5 to 15 years in additional sentencing on top of any crime that you are charged with. Any group of young African American, young Latinos, young Asians, any people of color that are just assembled together will fall victim to this new legislation. Now again, it is proposed, but the governor has already come out and said that he would sign it if it passes both chambers. I echo my colleagues' sentiments. I had the opportunity my colleagues' sentiments about a meeting with Governor Deal. I had the opportunity for the last 2 legislative sessions to work alongside of Mabel Thomas, who is here today, along with Senator Parent, along with Senator Donzella James, and actually participate in a signing ceremony for a bill called CJ's Law, named after my cousin, for hit and run legislation. Why is that important? Because this proposed gang legislation, I understand, is named after a young kid that has lost his life. No one here is condoning that type of behavior. But we are in opposition to a legislative, orchestrated, governor-stamped targeting areas that we know suffer from disparities here in these yet-to-be United States of America. Thank you.
So if we could be very specific as to what parts of this budget that we are objecting to. One, the accountability courts, which helps the least and the lost and the marginalized, those veterans who, for whatever reason, return to our communities and have committed a crime. We want to help them get back on their feet. They have committed the ultimate sacrifice of giving us their lives. Now is our time to help them and not to send them to prison. Another thing, the youth detention centers. There's an appropriation cut to youth detention centers that our children, not adults, our children are being sent to, and we take money away from them to be able to go back into their communities and become productive adults. But if they're in prison, they're not going to be that. And so the accountability courts, the Department of Corrections has cuts to health care for prisoners, right? Are we going to let them languish in jail cells and simply die? To be able to take them and put them into transition centers, taking resources from that as well. And so there's so much wrong with this criminal justice proposal that the governor has put forth. And we're willing to work with any and every person in this legislature to ensure that our communities are represented by this appropriation.